This book recommendation by Robert Thurman was originally recorded September 2018 at the home of Robert and Nena Thurman in Woodstock, New York.
Hi there, this is Bob Thurman. I'm co-publishing with Wisdom Publications, the Treasury of Buddhist Sciences. And the first book we have a backlist of 20-some books. We used to distribute with the Columbia Press, but now we're not just distributing but co-publishing with Wisdom in the special series, Treasury of Buddhist Sciences. We're thrilled to do that because there's about 3,000 books. We're going to do it, and it will take many generations of both the American Institute of Buddhist Studies and the Wisdom Publications, and which we are confident we'll be doing over many generations. Me and the current people there just have to get reborn and somehow go back to work for the institutions that we like. But anyway, for the moment, the first book is this book. And this is a wonderful book by an Oxford scholar who is also an excellent Buddhologist, and an excellent Western philosopher, creative and original one, called Jan Westerhoff. And it's called Crushing the Categories, which is his translation of the expression Vaidalyaprakarana, which is a book of Nagarjuna's. And we're very proud of this book and very proud of Jan Westerhoff for having done such a wonderful translation and study of it. Because it is a very difficult book, actually, of all the great Nagarjuna's writings, especially in the exoteric level, in his philosophy side. He also has a tantric side, according to us, according to the Mahayana Buddhists, but not according to modern scholars with their dating ideas. Because it means he would have to have lived for too long for them to think it's possible. Hundreds and hundreds of years. But we don't mind having a few Buddhist Methuselahs. We don't care about that. So, but anyway, this book is the most difficult one, in a sense. I mean, in a way, equally difficult. It's more difficult as a text, because it involves his critique of the means of reasoning and the means of understanding as formalized in the Indian logical tradition, which grew out of an Indian legal tradition, actually, for how to make proper arguments in courtrooms and to determine what is fair and just and reasonable in particular situations, and became used also for reasoning in philosophy. And the early sutras of that tradition were written in the early century, around the time of Buddha, early centuries of the Buddhist era, about 2,400 years ago, a little bit after Buddha's time, because I think he created the space for many of the great Indian teachers who were not Buddhists to write their different sutras, which for them, sutras meant a set of aphorisms based on the grammatical, famous Shiva Sutras by the great grammarian Panini. And then the Buddhists actually were the ones who really mainly used these ritual things, other than in Indian courts. But philosophically, for about 1,000 years after that, until 500 or 600 of the Common Era, that was around 450 before the Common Era, but about 600 of the Common Era, you began to have Indian non-Buddhist commentaries on it. But during the Buddhist time, the Buddhists had the schools and the universities, actually, and so we're using it philosophically. And so Nagarjuna, who did his philosophical main writing in the early Common Era centuries, it is believed, he wrote this book, and so many people have thought maybe he didn't write it, because A, they have a Western prejudice that Indians don't know anything about dating or history, which is wrong. And B, it involves dealing with the categories in the Nyaya Sutra, which did exist before Nagarjuna's time, but many of the Nyaya commentators, as a separate tradition, didn't exist. So the reason he did that was that many Buddhist philosophers in Nagarjuna's time in the monastic universities were using the Naiyayika categories for reasoning. And so his 27 critiques in his more famous book called Wisdom, which people often always call Fundamental Treatise on the Middle Way or Fundamental Treatise on the Madhyamika, even though its own title in its title says the title is wisdom. Prajnanama Mula Madhyamika Karika. And the root central way verses is the subtitle, actually, really. So the title is wisdom. So anyway, in that book, he uses the reasoning, Nagarjuna does, and to show the unreasonableness of thinking that anything in the universe has intrinsic reality, or intrinsic identity, or intrinsic objectivity, in proving the transcendent wisdom central discovery of the Buddha of emptiness, and that emptiness doesn't mean nothingness. Emptiness means that all things are empty of any non-relational component, some kind of intrinsic identity or objectivity or reality that somehow makes each thing an absolute thing in itself. And so that was Buddha's discovery, and it was elaborated systematically for the non-dual Buddhists by Nagarjuna, 400, 500 years after Buddha's time. And it's very, very famous, that book, although I'm not sure it has been, there's a good translation by Wisdom, but I'm not sure the finally good translation has been done. Maybe because of my own pride, thinking I should do it. I have one that I didn't finish. So, but it's been good enough for people to really study it. And anyway, as I said here, this sort of thing, but nobody did, yeah, that's right. And then compared with that book is Nagarjuna's further critique of the means of the reasoning, the categories that the Nyaya school, the reasoning school uses to make their reasons. And he also refutes them as being things that have intrinsic reality, the mechanisms of reasoning, which doesn't mean he does it reasoning, by using reasoning, but he has a more creative and innovative and flexible reasoning because he's not stuck in the rigidity of intrinsically real reasons, intrinsically real thesis, intrinsically real example, intrinsically real thing. Indian reasoning was very wonderful, and actually logicians would say, and definitely legal scholars would say, that it has one step better than the Greek syllogism or formal argument, in that an Indian syllogism or formal argument cannot be accepted, whether by Buddhists or by non-Buddhist inner scientists or philosophers, cannot be accepted unless it also gives an example where the reason and the thesis connect, so that you're not just reasoning in the air about non-existent things. You have to have a real example where the relativity and causal production are together in order to make the reasoning. All causally produced things lack intrinsic reality because they're merely relative. You have to be able to show a thing that is causally produced, and where it lacks an intrinsic reality as empirically discoverable, you have to be able to show an example and a counterexample, but in some more formal ones, but an example. And that's considered really essential to keeping reasoning practical and realistic, which is important for philosophers. And that was canonical in Indian philosophy from ancient time, whether Buddhist or non-Buddhist. And so Yan's book is the first one to really tackle this. And it wasn't tackled in the past because the people who were doing Indian philosophy were thinking of it as something outside of Buddhist philosophy, which is wrong, but anyway, they do. And they didn't know the Buddhist side of it, so they wouldn't have translated it. The people who do Buddhist studies don't know about the Indian reasoning system, the Naiyayikas, and so they wouldn't do it. So someone who is a personal creative philosopher himself, Jan Westerhoff, and someone who knows Buddhology well, that means the study of the enlightened mind, and someone who knows the Indian logicians' things, and modern logic for that matter, take someone with those combined skills and the linguistic skills, on top of philological skills, on top of all of that, to do what Jan Westerhoff has done. So it's a difficult thing to do, to study. It's not an easy book, but if you want to be a master of the central way or the middle way, the theory of emptiness as relativity and so forth, and really understands its subtleties and deepen your own freedom, inner freedom, by understanding what emptiness really means, then surely this is a subject that you should study. And it's really brilliant, when I write in my publisher or editor's preface, series editor's preface, I am personally very grateful to Jan Westerhoff recalling my own attention to this work and opening it up for me in his careful and thorough translation and analysis. I too had long neglected it, even though my mentors in the study of Nagarjuna had alerted me to its importance. But he makes clear for the first time among contemporary students of the work how the crushing the categories fits in with Nagarjuna's main critical philosophical works, indeed how it is the natural complement of the wisdom root and logically precedes the Dispeller of Disputes, another important work which Westerhoff also has studied. That's another very good work of his. And Westerhoff's interpretation is supported by Tsongkhapa, dean of the Tibetan centrist scholars, as I like to call Madhyamikas. I call Madhyamika centrist because I want to have an English word for it, and nobody wants to say middleist. And I once had a student in a class on Buddhist philosophy when I talked about the Madhyamika school, who came back to it later, because he said, what is that school of mysticism, the Madhyamikas? Are they related to the Hasidics? So ever since then, I like to be able to say centrist, which is not a quite proper translation of Madhyamika. You don't have to, the same word Madhyama can mean middle or center, depending on what sort of object you're being in the middle of or in the center of. So Nagarjuna, then Tsongkhapa wrote, translated by me, Nagarjuna, in order to demonstrate mainly the truth of the relativity free of the extremes of existence and non-existence, first wrote the wisdom root to the 27 critiques of the wisdom root to negate the probandum, the intrinsic reality of persons and things presumed by the advocates of the intrinsic objectivity of phenomena. And he then wrote the crushing the categories to negate the means of proving it, the 16 categorical instruments of Indian logicians, such as that of intrinsically real validating cognition or pramanas. So, you know, I wrote more positive things in this preface because I really, really enjoyed this book, and I really thought it was great. And not that I must say, reading it quickly, even as an editor, you know, as a sort of final editor, not the detail editor, Thomas Yarnell, who did the really, really serious detail work, but as this sort of overview editor, you still have more to do. It's a deep thing. It's like something that takes real philosophical effort to fully embrace and digest. But you can get the gist by reading it in a normal reading way, and it's really deep and powerful to do it. And it makes you realize that A, there are these wonderful things about reasoning that are important for you to learn, and B, you don't have to be rigidly caught up in some sort of absolutized version of the reasoning, which is how Nagarjuna frees you to even be creative in the context of logic. More logical, but also more creative and flexible in your use of logic. So anyway, that's my thing. Crushing the categories. The Vaidalyaprakarana by Nagarjuna, introduced, translation and commentary, that is analytical commentary, by Jan Westerhoff, published by the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, the Center for Buddhist Studies, Tibet House, US, and Wisdom Publications in their co-publication of this work. And no lesser an authority than Jay Garfield, Buddhist Studies Program Director at Smith College, and also Logic Program Director at Smith College. This translation of Nagarjuna's Vaidalyaprakarana is an important contribution to Madhyamika studies, to our understanding of the philosophy history of debates between early Indian Mahayana philosophers and their orthodox, that is, Vedist orthodox interlocutors, and to the history of world philosophy generally. J. L. Garfield, Director of Buddhist Studies Program, he also did a translation of the Wisdom Root, that is, and a Tibetan commentary of it, that is also worthwhile, J. Garfield. Okay, so enjoy, and we look forward, both at Wisdom Publications and at the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, look forward to your enjoyment of hundreds of works in this series, Treasury of the Buddhist Sciences. For those of you who are interested in the Buddha's revelation as a scientific, inner, as they call it in India, inner science tradition that can help you better understand how your own mind works and how others' minds work, and can be interfaced very nicely with neuroscience, Western philosophy, and should be interfaced in that way. Okay, 100%. Thank you very much. All the best.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, including special tours with Robert Thurman and geographic expeditions, please visit tibethouse.us. Trips in 2019 include Sri Lanka.